democracy and civil society. Now, again, if you trace the history very briefly, democracy of a kind was practiced famously in ancient Greece, but of course it wasn't our sort of democracy. It was males, it was citizens, it was free people, and it was therefore wealthy people, and therefore only, I don't know, a 10th or 20th of the population of Athens took part in it, and they could all get into one large square and discuss things. Now that model was largely dropped and occasionally revived in very small parts of Europe, like Venice or some of the Italian city-states, or later a little bit in Holland and 17th century England with the Parliament. But all these democracies ruled by the people of themselves were partial and they were very small scale, and they worked because you actually participated in them. If you were part of the democracy, you actually heard your voice. It was like a town hall meeting. Now, what has obviously happened is that the world has mushroomed since then, and something which sort of worked in a small city-state, sort of worked in 18th century, early 19th century England, though it was very partial and a lot of corruption and so on. But then it was put wholesale as a model, based partly because it was transferred to America, and you had the same small-scale societies where you could more or less have everyone participating. Then gradually these places got bigger and bigger and bigger, and you had to adapt it to a situation where now you have that system not only being attempted in places like Britain, which are, instead of being a few million people, 5, 6 to 10 million, is now 50 to 60 million people. But what about America now with 300 million or whatever? And then what about India and China with 1.4 billion people? How can that small-scale system work? We know all the problems. They're becoming more and more apparent, that you don't feel represented, that the people in power very quickly forget what it was they were elected to do, or new challenges come up which you didn't vote for, that you are in a large minority who didn't vote for them anyway, that people didn't know what they were voting for because they don't read the manifestos, and that it's extremely short-termist, that you can't have long-term plans. For example, the plans that I've discussed before in relation to military spending or ecology, you can't have in a democracy because you will be voted out of power if you pursue those kinds of long-term in the greater benefit plans, and therefore you just have to appease the voters. Also, you get increasing unbalance. You get, as we see in India now, or in America under Trump and possibly in the future, the political power becoming more and more powerful and destroying the boundaries between itself and the legal systems, and destroying the press and so on, and you get a move towards fascism, which occurred in Europe, all over Europe, except England before the Second World War. So democracy is very, very fragile. And what can we do about that? Well, we've really got to think about all sorts of models, realise that democracy of our Western kind won't necessarily work at all well if imposed on most of the world, which have other traditions. We can see it failing all over Africa, the Middle East, Asia, South America, and even failing in its heartlands. So we've got to think of other alternatives. And one of them is to think about the great book on democracy by de Tocqueville. When he talked about democracy, he wasn't meaning parliamentary voting systems. He was talking about self-government. What he meant was self-rule. And what he realized was that in a large, huge place like America, or in huge populations, the control of your lives has to be exercised, if it's going to be exercised by yourself, at a local level. So what he thought of as the greatness of British democracy in the early 19th century, when he visited, was local government. In a nice example, he said, if I was a dictator trying to take over Britain, I wouldn't worry about the House of Commons or the House of Lords. They're irrelevant. What I would do is to shut down the local parish council, the local vestry, that is the people who run the church, because they speak freely, they argue, they run their own affairs, and they are the threat. This is basically what some people call civil society. These are the many groups between the higher governmental level and local systems. And this, curiously, is to a certain extent what you find and have to find in China, because China is so huge that the national government has to delegate. And so national decisions, international relations, large mega projects, the legal system, and so on, have to be dealt with by the central party. And then each of the provinces, which is the size of a European nation, Yunnan, Jiangsu, Jiangxi, Fujian, and so on, each has a budget and size often of Russia. They are extremely powerful. They are more or less countries, and they run their own educational systems and housing systems, and much of it is delegated to that level. But they are still very, very big. So you have another level, at the level of cities and towns, mayors, who run things that should be run at that level. Below them, they have another level, at the level of villages or counties. And so you have 5 levels. And at each level, at the lower levels, you vote in secret elections for the officials and the local. And so, in theory, though there is much difficulty and corruption and non-participation, even in this system, but the structure is the one that we will have to have in all societies. And therefore, against the grain, central governments have got to devolve a lot of that power, much more of their power, as they are doing in some cases, to powerful mayors in England, down to local levels, and then they devolve it further. And that would give people a greater sense of participation over the decisions of their lives. It's a system which was envisaged, curiously, by the founder of modern economics, Adam Smith. He talked about how the economy could largely run itself, but you needed an underpinning of a legal system and an overpinning of a governmental system. And he talked about the governmental system as very light at the top level, what he called the night watchman state. That is, as in a factory, the machines are churning round, and you just have a night watchman who goes round making sure there's no burglars come in and that the machines are working all right. They don't need to interfere. They keep the system running. And that's basically what you need, a night watchman state with a lot of delegation to each level down. And that model would be something which could at least improve democratic systems very much.